The night it happened felt colder than the winter itself, even though the heater hummed softly in the background. I remember standing in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup while the clock ticked louder than usual, as if counting down to something I couldn't see coming. My son, Ayan, walked in with heavy footsteps that didn't belong to the boy I raised. These were the steps of someone carrying a storm inside him. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw locked, his eyes wild with frustration that had been building for weeks. "Where's my jacket?" he shouted, slamming the cabinet as if it had offended him personally. I tried to calm him, speaking softly, reminding him that shouting never solved anything, but he wasn't listening anymore. He was somewhere else, drowning in anger I didn't yet understand. He stepped closer, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before, an emptiness mixed with rage, the kind that makes a mother's heart tremble. I told him to breathe, to sit, to talk to me, but instead, he exploded. The argument grew like fire, every word sharper, every breath heavier. Then, in a flash quicker than thought, he raised his hand. For half a second, I believed he would stop himself. But he didn't. His palm struck my cheek, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. My vision blurred, not from the pain but from the disbelief. My son had done the one thing I feared most. He froze. I froze. The house froze. The spoon slipped from my hand, clattering onto the floor with a metallic cry that he muttered something angry under his breath and stormed out, the front door rattling behind him as if it, too, were terrified. I stood alone, the warmth of the soup replaced with an icy ache crawling up my spine. The light seemed dimmer. The air heavier. I touched my cheek, not to feel the pain, but to convince myself it actually happened. That moment broke something inside me, not my love, but my patience, my silence, my boundaries. But the slap landed before the hope even finished forming. The impact wasn't just physical. It felt like every memory of him as a baby, every night I stayed awake nursing him, every birthday laugh, every hug he ever gave me, was suddenly crushed under the weight of that single hit. I stood frozen, the sting on my cheek burning like fire, and the silence that followed was more painful than his shouting. He looked at me with wide eyes, not with regret, but with shock at what he had just done, as if even he hadn't known he was capable of it. My breath shook as I placed my hand on the counter to steady myself, not because of the pain, but because of the realization that something had changed forever. He stepped back, his chest rising and falling, and without saying a word, he grabbed his jacket and stormed out of the house, leaving the door open behind him, letting the cold night wind sweep into the kitchen. I didn't chase him. I didn't call his name. I simply stood there, alone, surrounded by broken pieces on the floor, holding my cheek as tears finally fell, slow, quiet, and full of a heartbreak only a mother can understand. And in that moment, as the wind curled around my ankles and the silence pressed into my ears, I knew one thing with painful clarity: whatever happened next, I would not let this end the way he expected. I would not scream. I would not fight. I would not cry in front of him again. I would rise, quietly, calmly, because sometimes the strongest justice a mother can serve is delivered in silence. The night it happened still hangs in my memory like a storm cloud frozen in time, every second sharp, loud, and painfully clear. I remember standing in the kitchen, the dim yellow bulb flickering above me while I stirred a pot of rice, thinking it would be a quiet evening, just me and my son eating dinner together after a long day. But the peace shattered the moment he walked in, slamming the front door so violently that the walls seemed to shake, and I could tell instantly, before he even spoke, that something terrible was burning inside him. He tossed his bag on the floor, muttered under his breath, and when I gently asked, "Is everything okay?" his head snapped up, his eyes red with frustration, anger, and something I had never seen on his face before, pure blame. He began shouting about things that didn't even make sense, accusing me of controlling his life, of not understanding him, of always being in his way, and with every word, I felt a tiny piece of my heart crack, because I had spent years raising him alone, sacrificing everything, pouring every ounce of strength into giving him a life better than my own. I tried to calm him, to tell him I was just trying to help, but he wasn't listening. He paced the room like a trapped animal, breathing heavily, and then, without warning, he knocked the plate off the table, the crash ringing through the kitchen like a scream. I stood still, shocked, my hands trembling as shards of broken ceramic spread across the floor like white tears, and when I stepped forward to pick them up, he moved faster than I could have imagined. His voice, loud, sharp, shaking with rage, rose above everything else as he accused me of ruining his life, and I whispered his name, hoping it would bring him back from whatever dark place he had fallen into. But then it happened, the moment my soul will never forget. He raised his hand. For a fraction of a second, I believed he wouldn't do it. I believed the child I raised would come back to himself. The truth wasn't soft, but it was necessary. Because, I said, my voice low but firm, a mother doesn't stop feeding her child, even when her child forgets who she is. His breath hitched sharply, and his eyes filled again. He lowered his gaze, staring at the food as though it were both a blessing and a punishment. I continued, but a mother also doesn't stay silent when her child loses his way. He set his fork down, hands shaking. I'm lost, he whispered. I know, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper, and that's why you hurt me. Not because you wanted to, but because you didn't know where to put the pain you were carrying. His lips trembled. He pressed a hand to his forehead, tears dripping onto the table. I hate myself for what I did. Good, I said gently. His head jerked up, confusion in his eyes. I leaned slightly forward, holding his gaze. You should hate what you did. Not yourself. There's a difference. And today, you're going to learn it. His breath stilled. The kitchen filled with a new silence, not empty, not cold, but charged with the beginning of understanding. This breakfast wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was justice. Served warm. Served quietly. Served by a mother who still believed her son could come back to himself. I lifted my eyes, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a calm that made his breath catch. For the first time, he saw the faint shadow on my cheek in the morning light, and his face crumpled instantly. His lips parted, and his knees wobbled as though the sight alone had struck him harder than he struck me. I hurt you, he choked out, and tears finally spilled from his eyes. He dropped down into the chair opposite me, both hands covering his face, his shoulders shaking with the kind of sobs he hadn't cried since childhood. The sight alone tightened something deep inside my chest, not out of anger, but out of the painful love only a mother can understand. I reached for the plate in front of him, sliding it gently across the table. The sound of porcelain against wood echoed between us. He looked up slowly, eyes swollen, breath uneven. I pointed to the food, simple, warm, familiar. Eat, I said quietly. Just one word. But it carried everything. He stared at me in confusion, his brows knitting together as though unsure whether he deserved to obey or to refuse. Then, hesitantly, he lifted a piece of bread, his fingers trembling. Even taking a bite looked like an apology, slow, shaky, swallowed with difficulty. He kept glancing at me, searching my face for something, anger, forgiveness, disappointment, but my expression stayed calm, steady. Why, he finally whispered, voice so faint I barely heard it, why would you cook for me after last night? I took a slow breath, leaning back in my chair, letting him sit in the heaviness of the question. Ayan stood at the kitchen entrance as though the room itself was a courtroom and he was waiting for a verdict he already feared. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes fixed on the floor, and his hands shook slightly as he clutched the edge of his shirt, small, fragile signs of a boy who had aged years in a single night. I didn't lift my gaze. Instead, I watched the steam rise from the breakfast plate in front of me, letting the quiet of the room serve as the wall between what happened and what was about to happen. The chair across from me sat empty, pushed back slightly as though inviting him to sit, yet the weight of the moment kept him glued to the doorway. The silence expanded, wrapping around the kitchen, climbing up the walls, making every sound outside, traffic, birds, distant voices, fade into nothingness. Finally, he took a small step forward, and his voice cracked open like something brittle and worn. Mom, please. He couldn't finish. The words dissolved in his throat, stolen by shame. I still didn't speak. My silence wasn't anger, it was intention. He needed to feel the weight of his actions before understanding could reach him. I heard him swallow hard, gathering fragments of courage that he took another step, and I could almost hear his heartbeat in the quiet. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to. His voice trembled like a child lost in a supermarket, desperate to be found. He moved toward the table slowly, like each step was a confession. When he finally reached the chair, he stood behind it for a long moment, gripping the top as though it were holding him upright. "Mom," he whispered again, softer this time, "I'm sorry." The silence stretched between us, long and heavy, but not cruel, only honest. Slowly, I pulled out a chair at the table and sat down, folding my hands in my lap, waiting for him without looking up. I wanted him to make the first move, not because I needed power, but because he needed understanding. A moment later, he stepped into the kitchen, and I heard the slight tremble in his voice as he whispered, "Mom." But I still didn't speak. Not yet. Because today's lesson had already begun. Imagining him standing there in the dark, unsure whether to knock on my door, unsure whether he even deserved to. A quiet sigh left my lips. He was hurting too, just in a different way. I went to the kitchen and began preparing breakfast, not rushing, not dragging, but moving with the steady rhythm of intention. The sizzling of the pan, the cutting of vegetables, the clinking of porcelain, each sound felt like part of the quiet plan forming inside me. I wasn't cooking a meal, I was preparing the moment that would become his awakening. I placed everything neatly on the table, a plate of eggs, warm bread, a glass of milk, fruit sliced into careful pieces. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, just the breakfast I had always made for him since childhood. But this morning, it had a purpose. As I set the last item on the table, I heard it, his bedroom door opening slowly, carefully, the sound of someone who feared what he might find on the other side. His footsteps were softer than they had ever been. He moved down the hallway like he was walking through a memory of the house rather than the house itself, touching the wall briefly as if needing support. I didn't turn when he reached the doorway. I kept my eyes fixed on the breakfast table, on the quiet justice waiting there. Behind me, his breath hitched, short, uneven, filled with uncertainty. He hadn't spoken yet, but I could feel the apology trembling on his lips, struggling to find a way out. Morning came far too quickly, sneaking into the room with a pale gray light that made everything look colder, quieter, and far more real than I wanted it to be. I lay awake long before the sun appeared, staring at the ceiling as though the answers I needed might be written in the faint cracks above me. My body felt heavy, but my mind had not rested for even a second. Every hour of the night had been spent replaying the same moment, the sound of the slap echoing again and again, the shock in Ayan's eyes afterward, the sudden disappearance of the boy I once knew. I sat up slowly, pressing my fingers against the side of my temple, trying to calm the dull ache that had replaced sleep. Outside my window, the world was waking up, birds chirping, cars beginning to pass on the road, neighbors moving about, but inside, the house felt like a different universe, one trapped in the aftermath of a storm. I walked to the mirror again, the soft morning light highlighting the faint shadow on my cheek. It wasn't swollen anymore, and the redness had nearly faded, but the memory of it burned deeper than any mark could show. I stood there for a long moment, breathing in deeply, letting the quiet of the morning settle inside me, and then, slowly, the decision I had formed during the night solidified into something unshakable. Today, I will speak through silence. Today, I will teach through truth. There was no anger in me, only a calm, focused clarity, one that rises only when a mother realizes she must save her child from the path he's beginning to walk. I stepped into the hallway and noticed something that made my heart twist. Ayan's shoes were back. Mud from the previous night stained the floor around them, and the way they were placed, crooked, hurried, almost thrown, told me everything I needed to know. He had come home while I was asleep. He had walked back into the same house he ran from, carrying the weight of what he'd done. I gently touched the shoelace of one shoe. A mother's justice isn't loud, it isn't vengeful, and it doesn't destroy, it teaches. And as I finally lay down, staring at the ceiling where shadows stretched across the room like silent questions, I made a quiet promise to myself. When the sun rises, I will not punish him with pain or anger. I will punish him with truth, and the truth will be the lesson he never forgets. The phone sat on the table, cold and silent, and even though I picked it up twice, I couldn't bring myself to dial his number. Not yet. Not while the memory of his hand on my face was still pulsing beneath my skin. I walked to his room softly, almost afraid of what I'd feel when I saw it. When I opened the door, the familiar mess greeted me: clothes on the chair, an open textbook on the bed, headphones tangled on the floor, but instead of comforting me, it tightened the lump in my throat. His jacket, the one he accused me of moving, lay draped across the back of his chair the whole time. I reached out and touched the fabric, my fingers shaking. This fight wasn't about a jacket, I whispered to myself. It was about something deeper, something he'd hidden for too long, something he didn't know how to express. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe, trying to steady the storm inside me. I returned to the kitchen, turned off the stove, and poured the untouched soup into a container. The normality of the action felt almost ridiculous, as if I were pretending life hadn't just cracked open. I sat at the table again, letting my mind wander through memories. Ayan as a child running into my arms after school, Ayan falling asleep on my shoulder during long bus rides, Ayan crying the first time he failed an exam, whispering, "I'm sorry, Mom," like he thought he had disappointed the entire world. Where did that boy go tonight? What swallowed him whole? Midnight passed. Then 1 a.m. Then 2. The house remained painfully quiet, and I felt each hour press harder on my chest until I finally stood up and walked to the mirror. The faint red mark on my cheek stared back at me, not violent, not severe, but symbolic. It was a wound on trust, not skin. I touched it gently, exhaling a breath that felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried. I wasn't angry, I was heartbroken. But buried beneath that heartbreak, something else was forming, something solemn and steady, a resolve. After Ayan slammed the door and disappeared into the night, the house felt like it had been hollowed out, leaving me sitting alone inside a shell that once used to be a home. The clock on the wall continued ticking, but now every second felt like a reminder of what had just happened, each click slicing deeper into the silence. I stayed seated for what felt like hours, my hands resting on my lap, my cheeks still throbbing with a warmth that mocked me with its truth. I wasn't crying, the tears refused to come, as if even my eyes were too shocked to react, but my breath shook with every inhale, each one reminding me that something irreversible had just taken place. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows, but inside, everything was still, frozen in the moment his hand had connected with my face. My heart kept replaying the scene over and over, his eyes wild with emotion he couldn't name, his voice trembling beneath the anger, the way his expression changed instantly after he struck me, from rage to horror to confusion. Part of me kept whispering, he didn't mean it, he's my son, but another part answered back with a quiet, painful truth, but he did it. An acknowledging that made my chest tighten as though a hand was squeezing the breath out of me. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the street. The faint glow of the streetlight lit a small circle on the pavement, but Ayan wasn't there. The emptiness outside felt like a reflection of the emptiness growing inside me. Where did he go? The question kept echoing through my head. Was he wandering the streets? Was he sitting somewhere crying? Was he still angry, still burning with that confused rage? Or worse, was he unsafe? I wrapped my arms around myself as fear crept into my bones, mixing with the pain, the shock, the motherly instinct that had been bruised alongside my cheek. I wanted to call him, but what would I say? What would he say? Would he even answer? And as the night grew deeper, I didn't cry. I just sat at the table, staring at the door where he had walked out, realizing something important. There are moments that change a home forever. And this was one of them.